might still be connecting on my side, but that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep, mine's on. I'm not sure about
Okay,
yours.
awesome. All right, I think we're live.
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We're back with Kara Francis, marriage and divorce coach. And we're talking about romance and money today. So, in the spirit of February and being close to Valentine's Day, we wanted to really focus the conversation on how do you make money more romantic in your relationship and not feel like it's a tense or stressful or even more business focused conversation. So we're going to get into it and talk all things like bring the intimacy back into money. So, Kara, I'm curious, when you think about money and romance, what is like the first thought that comes to mind? And be honest, because
Honestly, not much comes to mind because I think, like you said, it's so normal and I think programmed that like money and love are like very discrete, separate things. And that, like you said, money is all about business and it can be sort of tense or uncomfortable. Versus romance and intimacy we think of as like softer and more personal. So yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, like nothing comes to top of mind. What about you?
so I'll say, and I wanted to share a little story too. So I will say initially, when I was in earlier relationships, and even early in my current relationship, I felt the same way. I felt like it was very prescriptive and not very romantic or fun. It was just like one of those things you have to do. Like and I love math, but still just felt like an admin task and not something that's fun to talk about.
Like going to the dentist. It's like you don't
Exactly.
want to, but you know you have to.
Yeah, and like I get excited about spreadsheets. I love doing math. Like I like doing that part of it, but talking about it with somebody and knowing that they're probably going to have a different approach to it than I do, and that we're going to have to figure out together, especially because I'm such a also a very fiercely independent person. I hated that. I hated having the conversation. And one of the things that really helped me to change my mindset around it is I had a conversation early on with my now husband. And it was basically, I wanted to share with him what my money situation was, like how much I was making and where I was as far as like savings and goals and things like that. And the reason I wanted to broach that subject early is because I also wanted to know the same from him. And leading up to the conversation, I told myself all these stories like he's not going to want to talk about it, or maybe he's going to be defensive because I'm asking him these super personal questions kind of early on when we were dating. And I don't really want to talk about this because I grew up with the idea that you don't ask somebody how much they make. And I didn't like sharing that as much either. And so I had to get used to that idea. So I was kind of not looking forward to the conversation, but I did try to make sure that it was in a moment where, we were having dinner, we were both relaxed. It was in an environment where we had no distractions. And so I was like, I'm going to talk about it and like share my information first, kind of like I'm going to show you mine if you show me yours. And hopefully that'll, encourage if I'm sharing it, even if it's hard, that he will want to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did bring up the topic, he was so open to the conversation, and it ended up opening the door to an even deeper conversation that was like why we didn't necessarily talk about it early on in our relationships, how we felt about it. There was even a moment in the conversation where he was like, I'm really glad you brought this up because I've never talked about it like this with previous relationships. And after that conversation, I just felt so much more closer to him. It felt very intimate.
Mm.
And so I think that was one of the big turning points of changing my mind around it is like it can be an opportunity, not just about crunching numbers, because that wasn't the intent of the conversation. It was about building intimacy and trust, and also like coming to your partner with some vulnerability, sharing something that may be a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that whole story. The word running through my mind as you were telling it was like vulnerability. That's
Mhm.
really what helps people deepen their connection and build that trust, is by being open and honest about something that's not always easy to talk about, and really putting yourself out there to the person that you care a lot about, because love always has that degree of risk in it, because it's two people who are each making their own decisions. And so you put yourself out like that. And then if you have your partner receive it in a really loving, open, supportive way, like, yeah, that's going to boost those like lovey-dovey feelings immediately, because it's reaffirming, okay, this is why I'm with this person. We're aligned on this and we're connecting. So I could totally see how that would be like a boost of all those good love hormones, and just in general, just like building a stronger foundation together.
Yeah. So I know you work with couples at different stages of their relationships, usually leading up to marriage or during, or maybe even having, the discussion about splitting up. I can imagine that some of those conversations do involve bringing intimacy and romance back into their relationship, and how they do that. Have you ever had conversations with them about that as it relates to money, or like how to make that conversation less cumbersome or feel more intimate? And how have you seen that in your practice?
Yeah, I've seen it professionally and personally. So, in my first marriage, which ultimately ended in divorce, finances were like not something we talked about a lot. We each maintained our own finances, and then we had one joint account where we would each fund for that month's expenses, like shared expenses, and that was it. I had no visibility into his financial situation. He had no visibility into mine. Um, Everything was very like cut and dry, 50-50. You owe me this, I owe you that, Venmos back and forth. And it felt very transactional, very
Yeah.
business-like. Um, the second time around, so I'll be getting remarried in a few months now, but a couple of months ago, we did our prenup, which we've talked about before. And that actually was a great segue into talking about money. And even though prenup, you may think is also kind of like it's a contract, it's also sort of businessy. We weren't having these conversations through our lawyers. We were having them directly with each other. And it would be while I was cooking dinner, and we would just naturally talk about it. And I think how to make it feel less cold and less transactional really depends on each of your personalities. So, for example, me being able to talk about it while I'm cutting up vegetables for dinner, like that makes me feel more comfortable, like that, because I tend to run a little more anxious. Um, but we're still in that environment where like we're cozy, warm, and we're not working. We're just having a natural conversation. And so I think sometimes what can be helpful is just first and foremost, and what I do with my clients is raising your awareness of how you show up to these conversations, because that's kind of where it all starts. It doesn't, like, you could be having these conversations anywhere location wise, but if you're not clear on how you're showing up and how that's impacting the conversation, whether positively or negatively, that self-discovery and that self-reflection for me and my work is where I usually start.
I love that. This brings up to me, so one of the things that was really helped me in my relationship and also with my clients is money dates. And I think we've touched on this subject a little bit in some of our previous lives. But I really encourage a money date. And a money date is where you talk about your money, like your budget, your goals, what's working, what's not working. And I really encourage treating it like a date. So you plan it, you create the space for it. And I'll back up a little bit and say I think the most important elements of a money date is environment. So having environment where both of you are comfortable and can focus on each other in the conversation. It is timing. Because a lot of times when you bring up a little bit more intense or serious topic or something that does require your concentration, you don't want to bring it up like 5 minutes before you went out the door, or maybe when somebody just gets home from work and they're trying to decompress. So you really want to pick your timing and your presence and mentally how you show up with the intention. So really, like, I always encourage my clients, and I do this too, is like you go in with the intention that you're there to spend time with each other and give each other that space and attention. You're there to create a space for each other where you can be vulnerable, and you're coming to that conversation with the intention and knowing that both of you have each other's best interest at heart. And your goal is to figure out what works with you as a couple. To build on that, one of the things that I think is a good perspective is it's not always going to be the easiest conversation when you first start out. It might be a little uncomfortable, just like going back to my earlier story, how I brought the money conversation up early and I was kind of worried about it and it was a little uncomfortable at first. But if you continue the conversation, it can build into so much more. And I'll give you an example. I have one client that I worked with, and they had some fears about having the conversation. And they are planning to get married. And so they wanted to be able to discuss this topic in a way that felt good for both of them. So they started their money dates. And when they did the first one, it was kind of like, it's bumpy. They were trying to figure out how do they talk about it? How do they manage it together? And then we started kind of layering things on to the money date. First, it was just very simple, like talk about your money story and kind of where you're at with money. And then it evolved into they were planning it with activities that they enjoyed together. So they knew that there was going to be an activity that they could do either before or after the money date that they could look forward to. So they could associate it with something positive. And the other thing that I thought was so amazing that came up is it took the pressure off of both of them, and their attraction to each other grew. And it was because one of them was kind of feeling like the management of it was mostly on their shoulders. And that they were constantly having to check in with their partner to make sure they were doing X, Y, and Z. And then their partner was feeling a little bit like nagged or micromanaged, or that they didn't necessarily have to be checking on it so much. But what we did is we made the money date responsible for the check-ins. You already know that you have it scheduled. You know what you're going to talk about. So it takes the burden off either one of you to have to like manage it in between or check in. And what we saw is they started actually sharing the burden, and sometimes one would pitch in a little bit more than the other and vice versa. And the way they were connecting and talking to each other, it was like they were excited to talk about it. And they were like, oh my God, it just feels so good to see you involved in this conversation and excited to have this conversation. Or one of them would maybe take care of a bill or putting something in their savings without having to be nudged or asked. And the other one just felt like, oh my God, I love seeing you do that. And so you could tell that it was also contributing to their intimacy in other places because they just felt so much more connected and seen. And so I think that's something that we don't always see or think about with money, is that it can build that intimacy and trust and like create the space where it creates some attraction. So I'd love to hear your perspective. Have you had that experience personally, or have you seen that with your clients at all?
Yeah, I feel like just echoing what you've shared is it's all about how you view this conversation. And so if you're viewing it through the lens of, I have to bring up something about money with my partner, I'm feeling nervous, kind of coming up with your tail between your legs and like practicing it in your head a bunch of times, like that's going to create that more tense, stressful environment versus if you already have that certainty that on this date or this day we will be on a date and we'll talk about it together, you're already in alignment from the start because you both know going in this is what we're going to be talking about. And so it doesn't feel like you said, you don't have that dynamic where you feel like you're nagging them or you're carrying the mental labor for managing the financial health of the relationship.
Mhm.
So I am curious to know, like, oh, and just to echo one other thing you said, which is like the follow through, building the intimacy. So it's not just the conversation about money that builds the intimacy and trust. It's also seeing the follow through of like, oh, you're committed to what we're working on together. You're really showing up. And that also builds that trust. I'm curious to know because I feel like you've seen, and I know that you've done a lot of money dates over the years. And so, what are like good environments for a money date versus maybe not so good ones? Because I know that that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I'll say this, I think it's more about what you bring into the environment because I think it can be very individual for some couples. And the reason I say that is like sometimes couples will have the conversation at home just because it could be that you're talking about more personal information that you don't necessarily want other people to hear.
Mm-hmm.
It's a comfortable environment. And I've had other couples that would rather not have it at home because home feels like a place where they have to like do other chores or like they might have kids or other things that might distract them from the conversation. So it might be like going out to dinner or going to grab coffee and having the money date there. So I think it's more about what you bring into that environment. And what I mean is, you don't want to have like the TV on, so you have a distraction instead of talking to each other. Um, you agree to put your phones down so you're not scrolling or checking messages or email while you're having the discussion. You're not, I don't know, maybe if you have kids, you have a babysitter for the night so you can focus just on each other in that conversation. So it's really eliminating any distractions, just like you would any date where you really want to spend the quality time together. So you give yourself the space to really focus on each other in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So like not like skydiving.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example.
What's your 401k looking like?
You're like, hey, yeah. Although skydiving, if you're that couple, could be a great activity to plan after you have your money date. So maybe it's like you have a meal together at home or grab coffee, you do your money date, and you have a skydiving date right after that. So you kind of make a day out of it. I have a lot of couples that will do something like that. So they have a regular money date. Usually they talk about the money in an environment where it's easy to kind of maybe look at their computer and their shared budget tool and they review that and they can concentrate on that. And then they know, hey, we're going to try this restaurant that we've been wanting to try right after, or we're going skydiving. And it's something we're looking forward to. So you can couple it with an activity like that. But I think making sure that you have the environment where you can hear each other. And if you need to look at some things together, that you have the ability to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And for those of you who have read Atomic Habits, like this will sound familiar, but it's this idea of habit stacking where
Mhm.
you pair one habit, one thing that you're trying to create into a habit, such as having regular money dates, and you stack it with something that is enjoyable. So it's almost like a treat at the end of doing maybe the thing that is not always so easy. But then the more you do it, like you said, the easier it gets. And so if we know, like, okay, we're at dinner and once we finish the money conversation, then we'll order dessert. Like that's sort of like the reward at the end. And it's a way of celebrating each other together for having the conversation and making it a priority and really showing up for each other. But yeah, the distraction-free environment, I feel like you said, is key. And with my clients, it comes back to that that self-awareness. So like you said, the environment really depends on who you are, what your lifestyle is, what you got going on in your life. And so there's not a one size fits all money date because there's no one size fits all marriage. And so really reflect on what's going to work best for you based on the reality that you're living in versus trying to force yourself to do something that someone on Instagram says you should do it this way, right? So it's more about embracing the concept of the money date and then defining what works best for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a couple things too, that I want to emphasize that I think also contribute to the romance and the money conversation is when we were talking about follow through, and when you have an agreement on who's doing what up front, and then you use your money dates as like your check-in, you allow each other to follow through. So maybe one person is, I'm setting up our joint savings account and I'm going to have that done before our money date. And maybe the other person is like, I have this retirement account that I need to move from our previous employer and I'm going to make sure I have that done. And that's maybe one of our updates or something. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, it helps you build trust because you give your partner the room to show up and do that. And then when your partner shows up or you show up and you've completed your task, you're reinforcing that trust. And I think trust is such a big thing in building intimacy and romance. Mm-hmm. Instead of feeling like you have to check in with somebody, it kind of sends a message that you don't trust them or they can't take care of it, versus creating that space where you're like, okay, we have an agreement, we're having our money dates. I know you're going to show up in this way. I'm giving you the space to do that. I'm not going to check in on you a lot, and kind of vice versa. And also, and a lot of my couples do this too, if you need to adjust some of those things, you already kind of have your agreement on how you're going to solution that together as a team versus competing against each other. And I think that goes a long way in continuing to build that intimacy muscle for the money dates. And another thing that you said, which I love, and I like this in the money date too, is creating the space to celebrate. And a lot of the times we talk about gratitude, and I think a money date is such a good opportunity for celebrating your wins together and also expressing gratitude with your partner. Something like, it really made me feel safe when you set up your automatic deposit to our savings, because I know that we're building this savings to, have our emergency fund or to be able to go on this trip that we've been dreaming about. That made me feel really good. Or, we love when our partner plans a date for us, and maybe it's like, I was so excited that you planned the date and we budgeted for that. And so I could just really enjoy that time with you without worrying about us overspending or not having it accounted for that experience. So I think celebrating too and expressing gratitude for your partner and how they're showing up in the process is so important and builds that romance too.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I love what you said about it's not the money conversation in and of itself builds the trust, and then the follow through builds it even more, because it's one thing to say you're going to do something and it's another to actually follow through. And that shows that this is a priority to me. I am committed to you and what we're building together. And I think too, even if you're having a money conversation that is more difficult, or maybe you're going through a challenging financial time, or maybe somebody makes a mistake, right? And you're discussing something that's maybe a little more tense, a little more uncomfortable. I think that also helps to build the trust and the safety and the security, because I used to be this way too, where I thought that any sort of disagreement would mean that's the end of the relationship. They just that very anxious attachment style. And so being able to navigate the tougher conversations with your partner and know that no matter what, we're going to come out on the other side and we still love each other and we're going to figure this out versus coming into it feeling, like you said, maybe defensive or panicky, because you've already built that foundation from talking about money all of the times before. And so now having these tougher conversations, you're more equipped to do it, and getting through them is also going to build that trust and intimacy because, like, even when times get tough, I can count on you, I can rely on you, and we can get through it together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a teammate. You have a teammate that can really, they're bringing their own strengths and experiences. And if you can leverage that together, that can accelerate you towards your goals and building a life that both of you really love and are excited about. And I think that also creates some excitement in a relationship, is like knowing you have that support system and you can rely on each other and you're safe. And a lot of the times I like to remind my clients, we're not striving for perfection. It's okay if we make mistakes. We just want progress, and we want to like focus on, let's tackle this as a team. Let's, whatever comes up, it's just something that we figure out together. It doesn't mean that there's the relationship's over, or we need to battle each other. It's just that we've like created this foundation and this way for us to work on this, and we're committed to that. So let's just figure it out together. And I think, to reemphasize your point, I think it just creates so much safety and knowing that like you have somebody that can be your support system, not just from an emotional perspective, but also from your financial foundation perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's that idea of let's attack the problem, not the other person,
Yeah.
because when we do the latter, that's when we're operating at a higher stress level. We're not able to see as many options or solutions. We're not able to think as creatively. And so focus like your time and energy on like kicking the butt of this problem that has come up together, like a 1-2 punch sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, One quick follow-up question for you. So, and again, I have a feeling this is also going to be dependent on each individual couple, but what are your thoughts on like the frequency of money dates?
Oh, I love that question. I get this a lot too. It does depend on you together. However, I do like to recommend, if you're first starting out on having these conversations, whether like you've never had them or maybe you're restarting them, I like to recommend them more frequently just to build that muscle. And
Mhm.
usually that can be like weekly or biweekly. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that forever. Um, and you can, if that's what you like to do as a couple. But at least in the beginning, when you're trying to build that muscle and like keep the communication going, I like to say weekly or biweekly, at the least monthly. After that, I've had couples that maybe keep it up on a monthly basis, some of them quarterly, and some of them even yearly, because they're just the type that maps out something long term and they feel comfortable with that because they have their systems in place, and that's totally fine. I think the key is just agreeing to something that feels good to both of you, that you both feel safe and comfortable with, and that your lines of communication are open, and you also leave it flexible to adjust as you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that idea of maybe doing it more frequently in the beginning. I feel like there's sort of like a parallel there, even just like with therapy, right? So,
Mhm.
like, a lot of times, if you're starting therapy, normally we start at a higher frequency. And then as you continue to strengthen those muscles, you can scale it back a little bit and while still honoring the needs of your partner, right? Your partner may be a little more anxious about money. So maybe they do want more frequent check-ins, and you showing up and following through on that again is going to build that trust. Like, I hear you. I know that this is a topic that sometimes makes you feel anxious. So like, I'm going to show up for you and we're going to meet consistently. And I'm going to show you that like you can have that trust in me and our life that we've created together. So yeah, I like all of those. I feel like I need to get some money dates on the calendar now.
Yeah, I would say if I can tell anybody who's on right now or listening, once the replay is available, to put romance back into the money conversation, my homework for you is just to plan a money date. Make sure you're planning it with an activity that you both can look forward to. So if you want to talk about money at home and then maybe go out to dinner or do an activity together like skydiving or maybe checking out a movie that you've both been wanting to see, I encourage you to do that. And your first money date doesn't even have to be about crunching the numbers. It could just really be about talking about your experience with money and how you feel about it. And that's it. And keep the pressure off of like trying to figure out everything. I think that can be the simplest first step in starting the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's yeah, we don't need to be, pulling out the spreadsheet the first time you talk about money.
Yeah,
Let's like
absolutely.
our way in. Let's get more comfortable with the topic generally before we actually start looking at the dollars and cents of it all. I think
Yeah.
yeah, that's great advice. Any other thoughts or questions on this topic before we wrap up?
Um, I don't know. I encourage everybody to just think about money as a way to build that trusted intimacy. And that really goes a long way into putting romance back into the conversation. It's so much more than just crunching numbers together. And I'm
Mhm.
checking too to see if we had any questions in our live chat, but I don't see any. So, what
Yeah.
about you, Kara? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think as with all of the topics that I help my clients prepare for marriage on, just know thyself. So take the time
Mhm.
to get really familiar with how you're showing up. Do you like how you're showing up? If not, how do you want it to be different? And how does having these conversations around money with your partner, how does that fit into your bigger picture of the life that you want to live, the type of marriage you want to have, and really connecting it back to what the grander purpose of having these conversations. So yeah, start early, do it often. Please, please talk about it before you get married. I guess that's my only other piece of advice. Like, do not wait to talk about money until after you're married because you're going to feel more pressured, and it's better to be proactive about this stuff. Usually you can figure out a solution, but if you are feeling stressed or under pressure, that's when it becomes harder to find solutions. So start early and do it often.
Yeah, such good advice. Well, thank you so much, Kara. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. For those of you listening, we are going to be going live in a couple weeks to talk all about conflict resolution when you talk about money. So
Mm,
we'll be posting about that soon.
sounds good. Well, it's great talking to you. And yeah, we'll see everybody again soon.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.